Welcome, this is To The Root podcast, brought to you by Transitions of Indiana and WeGrowHairIndy, where we get to the root of hair restoration solutions, navigating hair loss, embracing life's journey, and everything in between. Welcome back to The Root podcast. Last time we had Will and Nate talking about how to prepare for a consultation. Nate's back with us today. Nate, good to see you again.
Happy to be back.
It's the day after the Super Bowl.
Right.
That was a blowout.
Yep. Yeah, that was quite a show there. I started watching around halftime, and I was like, oh my goodness, should I even keep watching this?
Right. Yeah, we had some friends over, and my kids had some friends over, and it's kind of anticlimactic. You hit halftime, and it's like game's over.
Were any of your friends from New Zealand, or are those the...
Locals,
okay.
Local friends, yep. Actually, it's funny because I had a meeting last night with someone in New Zealand, a Zoom meeting at 6 o'clock. I had another one at 6:30, and I got through the one at 6 o'clock quite quickly, and had already had a cocktail. And the 6:30 one, the guy got on the call, and he said, he'd been talking to my wife. He said, "Oh, the Super Bowl thing's on today." Super Bowl thing.
Super Bowl thing.
So, New Zealand, it's got a following, but it's far from our national game, which is rugby. So,
Right. What part of New Zealand are you from?
So I grew up in a little country town called Cockatoo. In fact, you could hardly even call it a town. We had a pub, a rugby field, which is our national game, a gas station, and a local community hall.
Okay.
A nice pub. The nearest town was about 20 minutes away. So I was there for about the first 20 years of my life.
Wow.
So I grew up there.
Wow.
How about you? Where'd you?
Small town, very similar, but
Yep.
here in Indiana.
Yep.
Just south of Fort Wayne. A little bit bigger than where you're from. We have about 15,000 people, but I'd say it's a country town, nonetheless.
Yep.
We had a big high school, but most people leave.
Yeah.
Do you feel like most people leave New Zealand when they grow up?
No.
Okay.
No, I mean, I think a lot of people go away. New Zealand's one of the most traveled populations per capita. So it's a thing in New Zealand to do what we call your OE, your overseas experience, which you get to your early 20s, you go to London, you go to Europe. Some people, of course, don't come back. And it's an expensive country. So people will go to Australia where it's cheaper to live and you can generally make a better living. But a lot of people went back to New Zealand during COVID. And so they had influx back and a lot stayed back. So, it's a beautiful country. We spent 3 weeks there over Christmas, so it was a lot of fun.
Yeah, you look at pictures, you're like, oh my goodness, where is this?
Postcard, every single shot. It's postcard. Today, we are talking about crown hair transplants. So, I know some facilities don't necessarily like doing crowns. It's something we've always done, and we've got quite a bit of experience with it. So, Nate's going to kind of step us through his thoughts around that. We're going to have a little discussion about the specifics of a crown hair transplant, do's and don'ts, and maybe some of the things that go along with that. When you're consulting with somebody and you hear that they want a crown hair transplant, what's the first thing you think about?
The first thing I think about is the patient's age. And the second thing I look at is, do they have hair loss in other places?
Yeah.
Crowns can be difficult. They take a lot of hair. Generally, if you make crowns a focal point early on, if the patient's in their 20s or something, it can mean more procedures in the future. And we just want to get an idea of, are they doing maintenance? Are they doing anything for their hair currently? Is it a 23-year-old with diffuse thinning that's barely hanging on here, but this is worse? Walk me through. I want to know more about it. First thing is I want to know more about it.
I think one of the things comes to my mind, I've been doing this for nearly 20 years now, is you always do the front before you do the crown. You kind of touched on it because of the way hair loss goes. And socially, what's in more demand, right? This is your money shot. And socially, as we age, you can thin or bald a little bit more in a crown. So I think the first thing is to make sure that when you consult with somebody, that the front is strong and they're understanding of the pros and cons of doing a crown at any point. So specifically, that global approach, we talk about that with hair restoration in general. Let's talk about that a little bit and why that's important in a crown area relative to consulting with someone.
First of all, treatment modalities work better in a crown. Mm-hmm. So, if an individual comes in and the crown is their concern, I always think, well, is this crown treatable? So not every crown needs a hair transplant in a crown. A lot of crowns can get filled in to a point where the patient's relatively satisfied without a hair transplant. Mm-hmm. It's needed sometimes it's not. So Treatments, especially in a crown, work better. And also, you want to make sure that the rest of the loss is stabilized. You know, if we really truly are focusing on a crown, we want to make sure that we've got some sort of treatment involved. Again, this depends on the patient's age, of course. What would you say if you have 10 guys come in and they say crowns are number one concern? How many of those guys also have loss in the middle, the bridge, and the frontal forelock?
Yeah, I'd probably say 30 or 40% of those guys.
Okay.
Yeah, it works forward.
Right.
And I think one of the first questions you ask is, okay, have you done or are you currently doing anything to stabilize the hair loss? Do you feel like it's getting worse? Because one of the things you don't want to do when you transplant a crown is chase the hair loss.
Right.
So we've got to be sure that we're able to globally take a global approach. So the medical modalities, you know, finasteride prescribed by a physician, Rogaine, our growth factor and plasma treatments work together. So really understanding those variables, the age of the patient, like you mentioned, of course, is very important. And when you transplant a crown, it's really important that you're not just filling in the gaps. So one of the skills, I think, of our surgeons now is wherever you see scalp, you've lost 50% of the hair, we can kind of treat the area like it's bald and go evenly through it. And what's really important in a crown too is if this is what the human eye sees, your transplant area is often that. So you're going outside that footprint to allow for any future hair loss. And then, of course, you add those other modalities in where you're keeping that background hair. Then longer term, even if the patient continues to thin a little bit with the hair that's not transplanted, he's still got an even natural look, maybe not the same density. But socially, as you age, the demands for density in a crown aren't as great, right? Transplant types in a crown. You know, we do, of course, we do multi-unit hair grafting, FUT. We do artist robotic and manual FUE. Really important that we're doing the right type of transplant for an area based on hair type and different things. Thoughts around that?
Crowns can be tough with smaller grafts. What would you say? A crown takes about 30% more hair to give it the illusion of density than a hairline typically would?
Yeah.
So the utilization of a multi-unit graft in a crown is just, it's second to none. I mean, the density that you can accomplish doing something like a multi-unit in a crown generally will surpass the density you can get from an FUE standpoint. Also, you get the preservation of donor area, future transplants and whatnot if those are needed.
Yeah, just jumping in there, clarifying that for everyone. Multi-unit hair grafting is a range of different graft sizes where our grafts will have anything from 1 to 6 hairs in a graft, where we're using those grafts strategically depending on the area we're transplanting. So the front of the hairline, you want very small fine grafts where it's a little bit see-through. As you work your way back, your grafts get larger and larger. And multi-unit hair grafting is the only procedure type that can get us the grafts that can have multiple follicles in a single graft. And here's how I explain it. If we think about a crown where all of your grafts technically go in a different direction, if this is a 2-head graft, okay, or if this is a multi-unit graft, what gives you more coverage? This does. And it's important in a crown because you've got to get that shingling and layering effect. So you're absolutely right. The type of grafts you use there are really important. And I guess if we elaborate on FUE in a crown, and there are some places out there that don't do crowns because they don't feel like I can get the outcome by just doing smaller grafts. How many FUE crowns would you say you've been involved with or help guide people through?
Small handful.
Not many, right?
Yeah, not a lot. Probably count on 2 hands, maybe.
Yeah, and even go ahead.
It's a very particular person.
It is, isn't it?
You know, it's someone who's probably aged. They have really good hair, and they truly only have crown loss. And it typically what I've seen with FUE and crowns is it's a combination of the transplant and some treatment modalities.
Right.
So you get sort of you're thickening up plus you're adding some density in there.
Yeah. There's a line on how much hair you've lost.
Right.
Where you go, look, yeah, and often I'll have the chat with somebody. If we do that, it's like, look, we're really just reducing the contradiction between this crown area and the front. We're not filling it in. Yeah, we're filling it in. It'll look like it's filled in, but these are small grafts. You're going to get less cosmetic impact. And even if the patient says, look, I don't mind, I'll do 2 FUE procedures in the crown. Okay, great. We'll do 2 FUE procedures. But now you're talking about the impact on the donor area. Right. So it's not just about the type of grafts you use. It's preserving that donor area like you touched on for future procedures. And recovery procedure, I certainly see crowns tend to be a little bit easier to recover from because you're not working around the facial structure, right?
Yeah, most of the tumescence tends to work down Patients don't get a lot of facial swelling generally.
Yeah.
And I also feel like they just, it's not front facing, so you're not seeing it.
Right.
And a lot of patients work from home nowadays,
Yep.
so they can continue their Zoom meetings or their work from home. I feel the same about that.
Yeah.
Most guys kind of get by a little bit easier.
Yeah, it's certainly an easier transition post-procedure. I always love watching the physicians make sites when they're designing the area, like just the artistic skill to be able to go in and make that swirl pattern and have that, I guess, that spatial awareness to see things in a 3 dimension when they're making those sites. It's amazing.
So it's very important whenever you're transplanting a patient, especially if you're working on the crown, to appreciate and respect the existing angles that are there. Most patients will typically have a whorl pattern, and that's something that I try to replicate as best as possible whenever we're transplanting, so that the patients get a very nice natural result.
So this is the pre-procedure room, Dr. Contractor, talking about crown design. I think what's important here is to appreciate the different shapes of scalps. And if you look, some people, the crown is sort of right on top or almost forward a little bit. Brian's is really on the back, where the scalp drops away. So the camber of the scalp plays an important part in that, right? And obviously, where the focus is the front, and we're not going to get enough crown hair to fill the whole crown in, how we use that hair is important too.
Right. And what he's marking out there is basically just the directions of that swirl pattern.
Correct.
And what he did was he kind of took the hair angles from the sides and just sort of incorporated that. Sometimes we'll ask the patient, do you remember where your cowlick was?
Yeah.
And no one ever remembers.
No, they don't. No. And sometimes if you have some hair in the front, you can get an idea of hair angles. The way the hair falls in the front will kind of dictate which way the swirl goes in the crown. Mm-hmm. But with Brian, because he's got a blank canvas there, the physician was taking his cues from kind of the hair that's left in the lower portion of the crown and those angles. And you're right, those dashes are sort of the angles the swirl will go on. The actual acuteness of the hairs that will be placed, that can only be seen once he starts making the sites to place the grafts. So he'll go in there, of course, and make little tiny microscopic incisions in that swirl pattern. Take him about an hour and a half to do it. But good example of kind of designing those hair angles in a crown pattern. I will say some patients come out of the procedure and they go in thinking the area is this large. They come out and they see this, they go, oh, wow. And that's the importance of over-transplanting, right? Talk to us a little bit about that.
Well, generally, if you have an area that's thinning, particularly in a crown, let's just say it's 8 by 8, that crown is almost definitely thinning in more of a 10 by 10 square centimeter area, right? So if the actual footprint, what you see if you take a picture, what that guy sees in the mirror, let's say it's 8 by 8, it's probably 10 by 10 that's actually thinning. And what you don't want to do is just transplant the bald spot. I call that a Band-Aid. Because what happens when this miniaturized hair around the perimeter thins, you need another procedure. So you always want to over-transplant that. It puts you further ahead of the game if you are losing hair. And you also get a better result.
Yeah, you do. And that's also the guy that comes in that's been doing modalities. It's really interesting. You see a very defined perimeter of that crown.
Yes.
And I tell guys, look, if it's that large and you hadn't been doing those things and we need to go 2 centimeters all the way into that perimeter, that's the difference between 5,500 hairs and 7,500 hairs.
Right.
So again, those modalities in a crown are huge. Right. Do we always have to shave a crown area? Now, we know out there in internet world and YouTube world, people that are considering hair transplants get really nervous about shaving the recipient area. And we don't have to do it. What's the line between, okay, this is a better outcome if we shave it or we shave part of it, versus, you know what, we can work through this, and the difference in density versus shaving it and not shaving it is negligible?
It depends on how much hair is in the area. I mean, if the patient is well below the illusion of density, I don't know that shaving is all that important. I mean, if they're practically bald, you get a few hairs in there. What would you say? Not as important, but if there's quite a bit of hair and it's miniaturized, I mean, it's under 50% density, you can tell it's thin, but there's quite a bit to work through, your best bet's to shave that down.
Yeah, agreed. And even if you can take it a bit shorter, so it can open up the field.
Right.
Because the doc is looking at a patient. If you can see scalp, the physician, is looking at the patient like he's bald.
Right.
So now the patient's looking at himself like, I've still got some hair there. We're looking at him like he's bald, so that longer term, your worst case scenario is we place the grafts so that down the road, if you lose more hair, you've still got this natural contiguous look.
Right.
And multi-unit hair grafting, although it's a range of graft sizes, in a crown, it's almost exclusively multi-unit grafts, the larger grafts, right? Sometimes in the center we might use a few smalls, but we get great outcomes.
One of the things that really drives home when I'm meeting with a client, I'll just say, look, if you get an area this big, and let's say you can put 1,600 cuts in there, if you put 2 hairs in each cut, or 4 hairs, 5 hairs in each cut, which one's going to yield a thicker result? Well, it's the 4 or 5 hairs. And it's like people just get it right then and there. They're like, oh, I understand why these grafts are important now.
Yeah.
I used to explain it in a few other ways, but I just found that that's the best way to explain it right there.
It's a good way. And the swirl pattern, of course, is very important.
Right.
The sign of a well-transplanted and a well-designed crown is a natural-looking swirl pattern. And for most guys, you have the remnants of a swirl still, so we can just copy those.
Right.
If it's not there, then they'll look at the angles in the front, match the swirl up in the back, and redesign that natural swirl look. So again, one of my favorite things is to see the doc doing that design.
Yep.
It's a lot of fun. It's awesome. You and I both had frontal transplants, front working, back multi-unit hair grafting, but obviously we've consulted with a lot of guys, sort of nailing into the recovery thing a little bit.
Right.
Wearing hats afterwards, how long does it take for the healing? Sort of walk us through that 10 days in a crown. If you've got a pretty active guy, how are you guiding him through that 10-day period?
Well, the first thing you want to do is explain to him that he needs to just ease up on the activity for about 10 days, which is usually the hardest part for a lot of the guys that are active out there. Essentially in the first couple days, your only job is to not bump your head or mess it up. I mean, the instructions are quite simple. Starting on day 3, instructions are a little bit more hands-on. Soapy rag, a little bit of warm water here and there a couple times a day, but you can actually put a hat on around day 3.
Yep.
So for me, my procedure, I believe, was on July 1st. So on July 4th, I was watching the fireworks. I mean, I put a hat on, a little bit puffy around the eyes, but I got out and about.
And that puffiness is just the tumescence that's used on the scalp.
Right.
Gravity's taking over. So that's not a medical issue, it's a cosmetic one.
Right. And usually around day 3 is when you get it. It's just kind of the time it takes for that fluid to kind of work its way down.
Kind of look like you've had Botox for a little bit, but then it goes away, unfortunately.
Right. Yeah, you're looking at
the wrinkles come
skin's
back.
real tight, you're like, all right. And then the next thing you know, you're like, all right. It's completely gone now.
Yeah.
I always tell guys, day 4 to 10 is just, you're day 5 to 10, you're getting a little bit more aggressive as the time goes on, and the goal is to sort of get those scabs off.
Yeah. A lot of guys are worried about washing.
Yeah.
And the scalp heals, the crown heals faster than the front because it's vascular, and so many guys are like, oh, I didn't want to touch it.
Yeah.
But you actually want to wash it because you want to stimulate the scab coming off. Like if you don't, stimulate little tiny scabs, then they're actually slow to come off ultimately, and you're gradually working at them so they start to flake off. Of course, the hairs fall out with the scab, the seed or the bulb stays under the surface, then nothing happens for 2 to 3 months. And you've got, a couple of days after suture removal, basically, and then all restrictions are off. I tell guys, wait 24, 48 hours and then go back to lifting, working out, and it's just a waiting game.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't a challenge at all.
No.
I mean, what do you hear in this industry? I want to do it in the winter, or the spring or the fall, right? Because summer, I'm going to be active. Everybody's got 10 days.
Yeah.
You can lay low. I mean, I'm super active. I was biking all the time. I was running 5Ks, triathlons. I took 10 days off. It was no problem.
And it's guys always say, well, I just need to find the right time. There's no such thing.
Yeah. Right.
It's like anything in life. There's never a perfect time for anything. So that's just where leaning on the clinic, leaning on us to kind of guide you around things like hair length and preparing, going into the transplant is really helpful. Transplanting crowns time-wise, I think one of the things, a crown doesn't take quite as long because you can get more people around the head longer. With our other frontal transplants, you get down to a certain point where 1 or 2 of the technicians have to finish up because you've got a small area.
Right.
But crowns, you can sort of get through a little bit faster because you get more people around the head for a longer period of time, which to the lay person sounds, so what? But a lot of guys, it's funny, they want to spend as little time in the clinic as possible.
Right, yeah.
So some places don't have a lot of technicians. We're loaded up. We have up to 5 people working on one case. So it's all hands on deck. You got to get those grafts in quickly, and we try to be very efficient around the day. Well, there's lots of things we didn't cover, of course, because you can take 10 guys that are doing crowns and they all have different hair texture. So if you've got a curl or a wave to the hair, I think about Dwight Whitten,
Yes.
the man, the myth, the
Yep,
legend,
yep.
from Louisville, of course. Beautiful hair.
Right.
It's got that blonde curly hair, a little movement in the hair.
Sort of a perfect storm.
It's a perfect storm.
Yes.
Although, just sort of getting off topic a little bit, but every time I see Dwight, he tries to convince me that tequila is good for you. And not sure if I agree with that, or I mean,
He's doing pretty good in the health department.
yeah, it's
He's
one
good.
of the cleanest alcohols, I guess. But anyway, that's irrelevant to his hair. But we can go on a long time. We can
Right.
talk about this for a long time. But this has been a lot of fun. I appreciate your knowledge and sharing that. And again, it's just horses for courses, isn't it? Doing the right thing based on what they
Right.
need,
Yep.
and taking that global approach.
Well, I appreciate you having me. It's fun being on again.
It's been a lot of fun.
Thank
Guys,
you.
this has been To The Root. Nate Schaefer's been joining us today. Nate, great to have you again, buddy. Thank you.
Thank you.
Email us at info@WeGrowHairIndy.com with your questions or topics you want to cover. Head to our website to schedule your free consultation with one of our experts. I'm Darren Andrews. Thank you for listening. Catch you next time.